Hello and welcome to another Ancient Warfare magazine podcast. In this episode we're looking at Volume 10, Issue 3, Rome versus Poisonous Pontus, the Mithridatic Wars, 88 BC to 63 BC. Don't forget, if you've not read the issue, you can download it or order a copy from ancient-warfare.com. Better still, if you subscribe, you'll get it in advance and then you'll know what we're talking about before you listen to the podcasts. So in this episode, I'm joined by regulars Josho Bouwers, Dahm, Marc MaCaffery and Marc de Santis. So I think before we get too far into things, we need to figure out who is Mithridates. If you Wikipedia him, there is lots of them.
It's the sixth one called Eupator. He's the king of Pontus.
Going through your good journalistic who, what, why, when, where is Pontus?
It's in Turkey. In what is now Turkey. So the north of Turkey. Bordering the Black Sea. That's where Pontus is located. The Pontic.
It was neither Greek nor Persian, or to flip it on its head, it was both Greek and Persian.
He claims descent from both Persian royal family and also the Macedonians in terms of Alexander the Great and the Macedonian kingdoms. I can't remember which way around it is. Maternal side claims from descent from Darius I, and then no, hold on, I might have mucked that round. And then the other side from Alexander.
Yeah, Cyrus and Darius, and then on the other side.
It's through Barsine, who is the mistress of Alexander the Great and possibly her son or maybe her nephew, or it's not quite clear, but one way or another, and then also ties in as well to the family of Ptolemy and the Ptolemy dynasty early on.
Yeah, and he styles himself as a Hellenistic king in terms of the titles and the statuary is very, very Alexandrian in terms of how he presents himself.
Yeah, but there's also some reliefs. For example, on the cover, the picture there is based on a relief from Arsamela, where he is dressed basically as a pseudo-Achaemenid ruler, or at least Eastern-styled ruler instead of something Macedonian or Greek.
There's a bilingualism to his rule.
That's more or less typical for the whole of Anatolia from an early time onwards. I mean, already if you look in the Archaic period, there's a free mixture of Greek and Anatolian and further Eastern influences and cultures, and bilingualism in Anatolia was very, very common. Already in the Archaic period, you have Greek cities where you have Greeks and Lydians living, and Carians, and they speak each other's languages. You know, if you were a Greek living in Smyrna, there would be a good chance that you would also be able to speak Lydian, most likely, if you were living in that sort of stuff. And that's something that you see all the way through ancient history in Anatolia, where there's just this confluence of these different cultures and languages, and it all mixes freely, and it's very difficult to untangle one from the other. I mean, there's always this tendency to say, Mithridates, the Pontic kingdom, it's a mixture of Greek and Macedonian and Achaemenid, but it's that mixture in and of itself that makes it something typically Anatolian, and it's very difficult to say where one begins and the other ends.
Is that similar, therefore, to the Ptolemaic Egypt in terms of the Egyptian and the Greek, and then also in the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms you've got the same? You've got the
I don't think so. For Egypt, not, because in Egypt it's very more traditional, because it's very the ruling class is Hellenistic, but even so, if you see how the Ptolemies present themselves in art, for example, on public monuments, that's very traditional Egyptian, like a pharaoh, and it's much more Hellenistic, Greek, Macedonian, upper class, let's say. Whereas in Anatolia, there's this very long history, this very deep history of peoples coming together, mixing, and oh, you've got a nice alphabet, I'll take that. And oh, you've got a nice way of making those columns. And oh, that's an interesting way of building a roof. So you have all these different things and all these different admixtures. And it's one of the reasons why, archaeologically speaking, it's very difficult in Anatolia to say, oh, this is typically Lydian, or this is typically Greek, or this is typically... It's just, you can't do that. You have these beautiful tombs in Anatolia, in Lycia and Lydia and other places, that have beautiful paintings on the inside. They date mostly from the late 6th and the 5th centuries and later. And they show all these influences. The way that they're painted resemble, like, say, tomb paintings from southern Italy. So they have this sort of Greek thing, the way that the eyes are painted. But then they have, sickle swords, for example, that are thought to be Lydian, maybe. And then they have these chariots that seem like they're Persian, basically. And it's all mixed together, and it's very interesting. And it's impossible to say, well, this is a tomb that belongs to a Lydian or a Greek. We don't know. We also don't know who made them. It's impossible to disentangle.
So we have three wars with the Romans. How far west were the Romans at this point? I mean, how do we break out a war with Rome?
Well, the Romans have been involved in the Aegean for quite a while, at least in Greece, with the Macedonian Wars of the second half, the mid 2nd century and later BC, and with the sack of Corinth in 146 BC and creation of the province of Macedonia. So they've been stirring in the Aegean for quite a while. And then we have Pergamon, where they had ties, and where the last king of the Attalids left Pergamon in bequeathed it to the Romans. So that's basically how the Romans got involved in Anatolia, as far as I remember.
He ends up taking over a chunk of Anatolia. And then within a matter of days, and it is a matter of days, he secretly organises the slaying, the murder, mass murder of 80,000 Romans. What I was wondering was, I mean, it's a huge act of terror. I mean, it's a vast act of terror. Is Rome really then forced to go to war with him rather than necessarily they're wanting to go to war? It's not necessarily a territorial conflict. It becomes this kind of obviously war on terror, to use a modern phrase. It's
the Romans have already come out and committed their own act of terror even before that, in terms of actually stirring up things in Bithynia. And one of the Roman generals, Aquilus, I think it is, Manius Aquilus, in breaking sieges during that conflict, commits some atrocities of poisoning water supplies and killing whole populations, which is even criticised by his own Senate back home before he's taken to task by it in terms of how Mithridates responds. So even though Mithridates is committing what can be labelled a huge act of terrorism in terms of something like 80,000 plus people being killed and assassinated in one day in cities across the Asian province, it's not without precedent in terms of Roman acts both in that area and also some of the Roman Roman acts in warfare of recent times elsewhere in the Mediterranean.
I want to get to Greece, because am I right in saying that the big more open warfare is in Greece? And I was wondering why also the Greeks sided with him.
He presents himself as a champion of the Greek, and I think it comes back to that sort of bilingualism, that he presents himself to the Ionian cities and the Greek cities as their champion in their style. So he's not a foreigner. He's one of them, and I think they side with him because of that propaganda, really. And of course he's successful initially, so therefore he's a side to go with.
But not everybody supports him. He's not always seen as not always nationalists follow him. I mean, is there a reason why some do and some don't? Is there something cultural, or is it just? I mean, why do some people see him as barbarian, which is pointed out in the magazine?
Well, it depends on which side you're taking in terms of what you're calling barbarian. I like I think the article by Adrian Meyer is pointing out that there's not so much. You can either look at it from the Roman perspective, which is comes from the likes of Plutarch and who am I talking? Appian, in terms of saying he is another barbarian like Hannibal, typical barbarian fighting against the civilization of Rome. Or on the other hand, he is perhaps taking it, as Maya says, a stance of being a stand-up for Greek Hellenistic culture against the barbarian West of Rome, who are taking over, destroying cultures like Carthage and Corinth and coming to get us, and he's standing up for the established Hellenistic / Persian culture of the East. So it depends on who you're calling a barbarian.
Well, the same I think with the atrocities is depends on who's reporting the atrocity and who calls it an atrocity. The Roman, even though the Romans criticise the behaviour, they get to rewrite. The good old adage of winners write history.
Do you think the Romans knew what they were getting into when they initially went to war?
Do they ever? Like Murray said, the Romans write the histories, and the histories about these wars, they're usually presented as some sort of formidable struggle, where you always get sort of the impression that the Romans try to... if you just walk all over your enemy, it's not a very impressive victory. So you sort of have to build your enemy up and make him bigger and more formidable. And that's why most enemies of Rome, especially the foreign ones, are always compared to Hannibal, like this big menacing threat. And the same happens with Mithridates. So it's a matter also of the sources, I think. As far as we can tell in the sources, Mithridates really put up an excellent fight, and he, like the Romans, seemed to have had an inexhaustible supply of wealth and manpower.
He also takes an approach like Hannibal, as in, there's two ways you can deal with the Romans. One is you can bow down to them and act as their vassal state, or you can go full on against them, and it's either one or the other, and he goes full on against them just like Hannibal. So I think that label is justified.
There's also a taking advantage of the internal politics at Rome, which is either just serendipitous, or it implies that there's a vast network of quite rapid communication to and it's indicative of later wars as well, that the kings in the East know very early that Rome's in trouble and that there's been a change of leader, and and it's quite rapid. It's not the sort of months later that we would sort of normally assume. They seem to find out very quickly that there's internal dissension at Rome. Go now.
Yeah, they must have had their networks of spies. That's.
I was going to say network of spies, but I avoided the phrase. I shouldn't have.
We've never had a magazine on looking at the Secret Service, have we?
No, it would be interesting.
The source material is surprisingly silent on spies and secret services, because it's still classified 2,500 years later. It still hasn't been
wonder
released.
if it's actually probably not more just people listening in on sailors' gossip, as opposed to anything particularly organised.
Well, I think it's remarkable because, of course, you've got traders who have ties with these regions, and whether it's they're in the service and the pay of these other kingdoms, or whether it's just gossip. I would tend to believe that because of the metropolitan nature of Rome, it is organised. You've got a seller with a brother-in-law who's from that region, therefore you will provide us, and in return you won't. It might not even be money, it might be a lack of tariffs or free ports and things like that. It could be very complicated and very, very little source material, but there are many parallels in later history of exactly that sort of thing happening in networks of spies, and they're normally merchants and traders who are reporting back to Lord Burleigh for Elizabeth's spy network, and inside Rome, Portugal and Spain is immense.
It's not going to be like Pontic ninjas at the Emperor's court or something. It's going to be something practical, like you say. Yeah.
Where's the article? Where's the article on Pontic ninjas? Rocking.
Well, you think people would also only have a limited palette of things to talk about, so gossip and current affairs are probably foremost in people's minds because they're not going to be sitting there chatting about the latest episode of Game of Thrones and, the football, are they? The one levelling thing across traders and merchantmen will be current, other than the price of grain and things, but current affairs. So gossip would spread.
Yeah, and I think also that sort of, you just tell me what you hear, and the remarkable network and webs of someone said that they're dissatisfied that their husband had just been sent on a posting to XYZ. You suddenly find out who's been appointed where for next campaigning season, and then all of that back history of, well, what are they like? Oh, they're corrupt. I was like, oh, well, great, well, we're in there because we can bribe him. And I think all of that sort of information about, basically what we would call prosopography, must have been flying around, and we know there are ciphers, we know there are multiple ciphers. Normally we hear about the, Julius Caesar's cipher and rulers, but there would have been all sorts of communication about all sorts of things. But I believe that, there would have been ciphers from all sorts of fields, we find them every now and then. We find a cipher that's got no explained context, and it's just a fascinating artifact. But I think it's again a reminder how much we've lost.
The best evidence in this case for it is, of course, Mithridates' actions in 88 BC in terms of actually organising the mass hit of terrorism across Anatolia, and the fact that that's pulled off in such a way in so many locations with such seemingly evident success is, if you like, a reversal of the information trade network that he's got established, at least in that area. And if at the same time, he's also got the links to the pirates of the Eastern Mediterranean seaboard that must be working in his favour in being informed or kept informed across the board.
At the sign, you will do this, they must have communicated that to a vast range of people. I mean, you get senses of it in Josephus. That the way the zealots are organised and things like that, absolutely, it's just there must have been vast networks of material that we've lost. That a single sentence of Dio Cassius gives us an entire thesis, basically.
There's actually, going totally off topic, I was reading something a while back in terms of the Roman Britain. At the end of Roman Britain, there being the scouts north of the wall, basically operating as, when they've given up actually manning the wall full time. I can't remember the name of them, unfortunately, but there's a unit of scouts who are basically patrolling north of the wall and south of the wall, gaining information so that where there needs to be attention given militarily, they can just divert their scant resources there.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, and I think it's a fascinating thing, and what we find is that when we do have evidence, like for this massacre organisation, the complexity of what they were able to achieve should tell us that when we're postulating and speculating on what they might have been capable of, we might not be that far from the mark, because they were, remarkably complex civilizations. So, we shouldn't underestimate what they were capable of thinking, achieving, organising.
Mithridates was also shrewd enough to make use of Roman distraction by the social war, which erupted in 90 BC, and he must have taken his time and then made his move against the Romans in Anatolia, and that's what led to the breakout of the war that brought Roman forces to go fight him in Asia Minor.
As a poor segue, Marc mentioned pirates, and I was going to go down a naval attempt to go down a naval train of thought. I wondered if the Romans really knew what they were getting into. Am I just plugging the same thing? Because reading through it, they seem to be scuppered from time to time, not infrequently, by the navy, by their lack of naval. They lay siege to Athens, but it's a land siege. They seem to struggle.
Romans would build up their navy to fight a war and then let it atrophy for decades because they didn't need it. And when the next war erupted, they struggled to rebuild it. And when, for example, Sulla was dispatched with some legions went to Greece in 87 BC. He does this in response to Mithridates' provocations in 88. He arrives there in the spring of 87, and he lays siege to Athens and Piraeus, but his lack of ships really hampers him. He doesn't have enough troops to besiege both cities at once, so he has to more or less, switch forces between Athens and Piraeus to deal with them. But at all times, command of the sea lay in the hands of Mithridates and his lieutenants, and the Pontines were able to leave Piraeus because of their possession of ships. Were able to depart, and Sulla tried to remedy this. He sent Lucullus off to gather ships from various clients around the Aegean, but that took him all winter, and until the Romans were able to actually get some naval forces together, they were at a severe disadvantage, at least fighting the Pontines.
Where were they rustling ships up from?
Various client states. But what it seems what happened is, and this is why the piracy issue has loomed so large in the historiography of the Mithridatic Wars. When the Romans would requisition ships, since they didn't have enough of their own, those are ships that are now no longer available to suppress piracy. And the pirates took advantage of the lack of protection now in the Aegean. And certainly, I think that they were operating, at least with the tacit approval of Mithridates himself. That is, they helped him out. They probably were grabbing all sorts of loot that they could, and they were hurting Roman interests while doing so. I don't know whether Mithridates was necessarily directing them to the extent that Roman writers accused him of. I think that I don't think that Mithridates had that element of control. The pirates were going to do what they were going to do. But one of the things about piracy in the ancient Mediterranean is that whenever there was a war, the pirates came out to operate, especially because there would be something for them either to grab while the main combatants were busy with each other, or there'd be some need for their services, and I think that's pretty much what was going on. Plus, they're the Aegean and the southern coast of Anatolia were dotted with all sorts of port towns where these pirates would have lived. And bear in mind, I don't think anybody was necessarily walking around and said, well, what's your job description? It's a pirate. There were pirates, but I think that it was more of something that opportunistic. That is, they were sailors, merchants, what have you. They had the ships, and when these wars were taking place and the big forces were occupied with each other, they emerged.
Well, I wondered if piracy was a side product of war, because when you've got war, and people are going out rustling up essentially mercenaries. When they're not in use, once you've created the need for a mercenary force, does that not also breed piracy? So one day there might be pirates, and the next day there might be mercenaries.
Certainly, whoever was engaging in seaborne piracy, they could easily, if they were no longer operating maybe with Mithridates, because there are some indications that pirates were at least somewhere in the vicinity operating with Mithridates' own fleet. If the war ends, then I'm sure that they would have gone back to their own independent endeavors. That would certainly make sense. What was going on? The thing is, the Romans were simply just not interested in suppressing piracy until it became so bad later on, they had to dispatch Pompey in some gigantic Mediterranean-wide operation.
And do we know whether the pirates are approaching both sides and offering to be their agent? Whenever they're basically taking advantage of the situation and saying, "Well, you need those people taken care of. We'll plunder their ships."
That's an interesting question, because while the Roman historians accused, obviously, Mithridates of piracy and engendering this piracy, Mithridates accused the Romans of engendering piracy too. Probably, it's the dividing line between a pirate and someone who is operating in some sort of privateering role, at the distance of over 2,000 years, I think it's difficult to tell who was doing what and with how much of an official approval. The thing is that it probably the simplest way to describe what was going on was that, yes, I think that Mithridates was doing more than winking at a lot of this piracy, but many of these pirates were self-starters and went out and grabbed what they could, and it was obviously very, very damaging.
You've also got the issue of where Mithridates gets his funding from, and one of the explanations that is given by Meyer is that part of his seemingly endless supply of funding comes from his association or business dealings with the pirates.
Well, I don't know how any sort of funding flowed from the pirates to Mithridates himself. Certainly one of the difficulties that, and one of the reasons why piracy existed in the first place, was that everybody wanted slaves, and there was markets for them, and the pirates were supplying them. So the Romans were essentially buying the product of the people who were robbing them. Okay, and that was just true for all participants. That's how I view it.
It's tricky not to be analogous when you're dealing with piracy with the 16th and 17th century, but what the model there was, which I think works and may well be that's the way piracy always worked, was if you commissioned pirates, you basically said, you go and do the mischief you do. So there's not like that, as you were saying, there's not the control. There's just I know who you're operating for. And what would then happen, obviously, is we know that ships carried flags to identify them as particular nationalities or kingdoms. And therefore, you would attack Roman shipping or Roman allied shipping and not your friends shipping, unless you were a truly pirate, in which case you'd attack both and plunder both and only give the tithe on one side. And that was the other thing, was that you would have a tithe of plunder taken from a particular kind of shipping in return for a license or free portage in Pontic city-states, for instance.
That's where piracy shades into privateering, and I don't want to make that distinction so clear cut.
No, you don't have to. I mean, there is ancient precedent for that also. I mean, if you look in the Odyssey, the typical question you ask somebody who arrives by sea is, are you here just roving like pirates do, or are you here on particular business? So are you here to trade, or are you here just as a stop on your way to raiding my neighbors next door? Because obviously you're talking to them, so they're not raiding you.
Even Herodotus' accounts of trade in Africa is very similar, that they avoid the ships because they think they're raiding, and then they work, try and persuade them without speaking the language that they're trading by leaving goods and then walking away and then coming back, which some people doubt, but it's a very good way to explain to people that we're not here to kill you and take you off as slaves. So I think one of those eternal methods of doing business. Very polite, and the Vikings are the same. The Vikings, exactly the same question: are you here as raiders or traders?
No, and that ties back into the opportunistic angle that Marc was commenting on earlier. I mean, it's not difficult to imagine that if you're a well-equipped ship with loads of men and you go by this little coastal town and you think like, oh, we could take that, we can take all their stuff. And then you just raid it and you murder a few people and you take all their stuff, and then you go to a bigger city and go like, yeah, no, we're gonna play it safe here, and then you just sail into port and you unload your goods and that sort of stuff. So it's,
yeah. And you when you start getting a reputation for doing that, you change your flag and the name of your ship, and you go, well, no, we're not them. We saw them.
That's the advantage of the ancient world. I mean, you don't have photographs or internet or mobile phones or identifying banners, so it's not like, oh, there's the Coca-Cola pirates again. No, we have to avoid them.
Yeah.
We're staying with the Pepsi pirates because we can trust those.
Although, the number of single survivors who are eyewitnesses and come and report on that sort of stuff is quite widespread. You're looking for the guy with the eye patch and the parrot. It's like,
well, there are particular nations, of course. I mean, with Mithridates, it's the Cilician pirates mostly,
and the Cretans as well.
Yeah, exactly. So if you run into some sort of salty sea dog with a heavy Cilician accent in his Greek or his Latin.
Yep, if he's got a peg leg and an eye patch, don't trust him.
Precisely.
No. The ancient sources, for the most part, they will only number the warships, the genuine warships in each fleet. But every now and again, it becomes clear that when any time that you had, say, 60 triremes or 100 quinqueremes moving, that these would have been accompanied by many more smaller ships of various sizes, either scouting vessels that didn't warrant mention, but they are, except occasionally, so we know they're there. And also, fleets were often followed by transport fleets, that is, merchant fleets, looking to sell food, or other supplies to the crewmen on board the warships.
It's basically the maritime analog for what you have on land with the armies, which also have a large baggage trains and loads of followers also trailing behind.
And I was just going to say that I can imagine that many of these ships, whatever they were, we're talking about pirates. I don't necessarily think that we have to expect that all of these pirates were operating some sort of war galley. They may very well have been merchantmen with enough, sailors aboard to pursue their own, piratical activities as they're moving along. And as a matter of economics, I don't think that either the Romans or Mithridates could have afforded to pay all of these men, put them in his service. I think that they were operating that for the most part on their own, perhaps under the aegis of, say, Mithridates, but they got their own capital together, recruited their own sailors, and went off and did what they wanted to do.
I was reading actually Caesar and the Alexandrian War the other day, actually, and came across something quite similar in terms of one of the naval actions there, where he endeavours to re-embark upon a ship, and it's such a chaotic scene that he ends up abandoning the warship that he was about to embark upon because it was listing so badly, and gets aboard a lighter that's come alongside in order to get away from the land forces that they've just experienced a turnaround with. So again, another example of a non-regulation warship involved in the battle.
Is that the same? Am I thinking of the film, or is that in the sources for Antony even? In the film, Cleopatra, he jumps on a lighter and flees to her ship. But other than Horace saying he fled, I can't think if there's a source to say that he did that. But No,
in the sources he changes ships, doesn't he?
Yeah, I think so.
They rendezvous at a port in southern Greece, and then he changes onto the Egyptian vessels, I thought.
Yeah, and that's one of the other sort of standard piratical practices is you don't necessarily have the strongest armed ship. You have the fastest ship that can get in and get out. And therefore, you're not going to go toe to toe with the navy with number of ballistae and things like that. You're going to be quick to be able to catch your prey and then do prize ships and all that sort of thing. So
these piratical raids, these were not necessarily ship to ship encounters. These were coastal raids where they would descend upon a town, a village, and then be off. The thing is that in order for an ancient battle fleet to be effective, it had to mass in one place, and that meant that everywhere that the battle fleet wasn't was relatively unprotected, and certainly many towns and cities would have had ships of their own for their self-protection. But if these were being requisitioned, then certainly that would have that self-protection would have suffered. And plus, I think simply the chaos that would have been engendered by the war would have resulted in all sorts of opportunities for pirates to take part in whatever they could.
How much do you think they aided him in the three wars, or worked against Rome, whether it be centrally organised or not?
Not enough to defeat Rome, but certainly enough to hurt them. For example, I think it was, I think his name was Marcus Antonius, who was dispatched to Crete to suppress some pirates, and not very well. I mean, he tried, but one of the things that they learned was that if you were going to suppress piracy effectively, you needed to take control of all of their coastal ports, or island bases. All ancient ships, but especially galleys, which were crewed by large numbers of men and couldn't carry much in the way of provisions, they had to return somewhere to port to revictual or to sell their loot, right? So if you can, there in that regard, they were a lot like modern airplanes. That is, they can do a lot, but they have to come back to base relatively frequently. So the Romans made the effort to grab these bases, and that was ultimately towards the end of our period. That was the reason for the extraordinary commission granted to Pompey to scour the Mediterranean of pirates. And certainly once the Romans gained control of the entirety of the Mediterranean littoral, piracy, I'm going to say piracy by and large came to an end. Did it never happen? I can't say that, but that pretty much ended piracy as an ongoing concern, leading into the imperial period.
By contrast, then, can you argue that piracy needed to have a land-based power supporting it in order to have a sort of a continual existence? They needed a Mithridates or someone like that to support them.
Well, they needed division within those land-based empires. I mean, because Cilicia at that point is operating between, you've got the Romans in the west, you've got the Parthians in the east, you've got this Pontic and Armenian, developing empires in the north to it. Cilicia is well placed between them to sort of, fill in the gaps as such.
We vaguely touched upon finance before, and we have a question from Facebook. Mithridates never seems short of money, and yet the area of Pontus does not appear to be naturally wealthy. Would you care to speculate on the possible source of his wealth?
It's actually very wealthy. It's well situated in terms of the Black Sea, and it's got you've got the grain coming down from the steppe. You've got mineral resources of that area being very rich. You've got in terms of produce, I should say, things like apricots being harvested in that area and entering into the Mediterranean market through there. You've got the Pontic Empire, as it develops under Mithridates, dominating eventually that access to the Black Sea region. So it's well positioned in all of that. It's not really any surprise in the way that he fosters trade links, for want of a better word, with the likes of even Parthia, his close links to Armenia, even links to the Thracian tribal areas. There's a lot of scope there for actually making a lot of money. So whether it's enough that, whether that can definitely account for all of the money that Mithridates uses, that would be up for debate, maybe. But it seems to me, have a lot of possibilities there.
Anatolia is very rich, and I think the big advantage the Mithridates had over the Romans was that there wasn't a lot of overhead that he had to work with. I mean, with Rome, all the money that the generals spent had to be okay through the Senate, raised in taxes. It's a lot easier when you're an absolute monarch of a Hellenistic kingdom to pull all the money towards you than it is when you're a general operating within the confines of the Roman Republic and the systems that they have in place. I think the Mithridates was a lot quicker on his feet than the Romans were, and that was probably one of the reasons why they were having so much trouble with him.
Being a good Hellenistic monarch, he's also fostering the family connections around the Black Sea and developing it as a family base.
And the other thing is focus. He's not having to spread his interests. He's got a focus to spend on, whereas Rome's got multiple problems at this time. So when you're hell bent on conquest, you can go into a total war footing if you need to.
Was there anything different in his way of making war? I did say in my email, I'm sure there's an analogy here between how Ali could beat Foreman couldn't beat Fraser, but I can't quite get the analogy to work for some reason. I'm sure there's a boxing analogy, and he can beat him, but not him, but he can beat him, and it all sort of squares some sort of circle. But
you could dance like a butterfly and sting like a bee.
Yeah,
that's.
Yeah, maybe. I think there are certainly aspects of the way he makes war, like talking about spy networks and organising massacres. That is certainly not standard, but I think otherwise.
Also taking small doses of poison in order to build up a resistance against people who want to poison you isn't exactly standard either.
He's also got a good position in terms of he's not taking on war on two fronts as such. He's taking on the West, whilst he makes this great alliance with Tigranes, who's going to focus on taking on Parthia. And in the meantime, okay, it doesn't work in the end, but it has got that element of we'll just remain focused on my part, and I've got them back covered.
I mean, in a way, he fights Rome for longer than Hannibal was able to, in terms of the sort of the 89 to 70 to 63. So it's a very, he resists for a very long time. Not that it was continuous in the way that the Hannibalic Wars were, but
no, because it also didn't take place, of course, in Roman territory as such, so that's also a major difference.
Also, Mithridates isn't himself involved, in every aspect of the warfare, like Hannibal. Mithridates sends out his generals to do that aspect of the Greek wars, and as such, he retains for a long time, at least in the earlier period, a fairly solid base from which to work.
Is the makeup of his forces any different to he's got his cataphracts, he's got his imitation legions. How do imitation legions work against real legions?
Well, we don't know a lot about the imitation legions. They pop up in a number of Hellenistic kingdoms, but the amount of sources for them is very, very limited. And what we do have seems to suggest that they were more or less comparable to Roman troops, and they were also sometimes trained by Roman soldiers and officers, willingly or unwillingly. But there's not a lot of information.
By the time you get to Julius Caesar, he ends up, when he's in the east and short of troops, he ends up getting a couple of his allies at that time, including Mithridates' son, to... or not Mithridates' son, sorry, because he's fighting against Mithridates' son, sorry, in the end. I'm just trying to think which of the Hellenistic monarchs, smaller ones at that stage, he ends up getting some of these stand-in legionaries to join and bolster his own forces. And they seem to actually take on the role fairly easily and assimilate.
Yeah, so. It's interesting. In reverse, you get the opposite happening later on, where you get imitation phalanxes, And again, you've got these, these handbooks of how, I don't know of any legionary handbook. The only ones you get are the castramentation texts about how to do a Roman camp. But, we have Tactica for how to draw up your own phalanx. And if you want a phalanx, this is how it works, which are all, they're rejected by anyone saying it's a practical handbook. But if you wanted to draw up a phalanx and train it, those handbooks give you what you need. I don't know of a legionary handbook in the same vein, but you would imagine if you've got a Roman trainer and you've got these imitation legions, there could be something very similar occurring. That if you want a Roman legion because they've conquered most of the known world, this is how you do it. This is you've got these, you've got your maniples, you've got your centuries, you've got very mathematically possible, just like our reconstructions of the legion.
So looking at makeup of the forces, another Facebook question: what was the role of non-Romans in the Roman army, Greek allies, mercenaries, at this point of Roman warfare? Did the Romans primarily depend upon their legions, or was there an effort to bolster Roman forces with local allies? Asia Minor seems to be far from their recruiting base in Italy.
They've got Anatolians in their army by the end of the Mithridatic Wars, certainly. I mean, when you've got Pompey going over and pursuing Mithridates into the east, there is mention of Anatolians being used.
God, is that it? The answer was shorter than the question.
You've also got the social war happening in the same period. So there's this sort of the dependence of Rome upon allies and Soci and things. But I think, it's hard to know what they did make use of locals, because there's obviously dangers in using local troops in terms of reliability and betrayal. But I think, that's certainly doable, just whether there's any, like with, sources on fleets, our sources tend to concentrate on the legions and not any of the associated forces that went with a Roman commander. So when Marina attacks, he has 2 legions. That's what we're told, because that's the garrison of the province. So it's very difficult, very often, to go roll. And normally our mathematical thinking is 2 legions and therefore the equivalent number of allies of auxilia, and that's almost as far as we can go sometimes. So when we get Anatolians mentioned, it's sort of like we have to latch onto that, but it's very tricky to extrapolate that out into greater involvement.
Yeah, this is the problem with with most accounts of battles as well. They tend to focus on the core infantry and not on the auxiliaries and not on the supporters and not on the allies and whatever.
Messing about on the wings.
None of that stuff. Straight down the center.
Well, usually that's always considered ineffectual anyway. It's the big deciders in ancient battle accounts are always the core infantry, the native peoples, the heavy infantry that go in and that do the business of actually fighting the battle and winning the battle mostly. So there is little interest in all the other hangers-on, basically, that they consider to be less important. It's like Thucydides describing a battle, and then he says, you've got some light armed troops, they also fling some stuff, and then you have the phalanx moving in. And it's the same also with the Romans, where it's like, you may have those, but then you have the Roman legions marching across the battlefield, and that's...
So it's like the glamour role. I mean, even Alexander, it's all about the phalanx and what the phalanx does, regardless of what he's doing.
Well, and Alexander's cavalry,
leading cavalry charges. Like, that doesn't matter, because you wouldn't be able to do that without us and the legion in the phalanx. And I think it's a very interesting, it changes over time to become cavalry as the glamour, heavy bulk of an army in the medieval period, whereas for most of the ancient world, the glamour is the Roman or the Greek heavy infantrymen, and we know that they had other, very important armed forces.
In terms of Alexander, the cavalry are probably more important in reality than the phalanx, but it's the phalanx that gets the hoop.
The phalanx allows him to do what he does with the cavalry, but he wins the battles with his cavalry. But we know, like Iphicrates using of peltasts and other where light armed troops and even cavalry, Hannibal's use of cavalry is what wins the battles. But throughout the period, the the importance of the heavy infantryman and the problems that causes for us, whereby, how did a hoplite fight? How did a legionary fight? How did this all work? And even, things as far as the athismos, the shove. It's like, there's no shove at all. It's like, well, then why do we have centuries of people talking about the importance of the shove if there's not a shove, So that's, but there's the glamour of the heavy infantryman is a present throughout the ancient world. It's fascinating.
So what happened to Mithridates?
The inglorious end.
Well, he ends up getting let down by the family, really. He flees from Pompey. Pompey loses interest in the chase when it gets up to the Caucasus, and he decides there's richer pickings down south in Syria, and leaves Mithridates to wander up north, ending up in the Bosphorus, where he seeks shelter with one of his sons and one of his daughters, and his son decides that it would be maybe more politically correct to go with the Romans at this time, and yes, perhaps does away with Dad, although that's where it gets a little bit weird, and there's some suggestion that maybe Mithridates during a coup tried to kill himself unsuccessfully with poison because he spent years developing that, but otherwise maybe he was perhaps got assassinated by one of his offspring in order to cozy up to the Romans, or on the other hand, was it all just a feint and maybe they handed over an old mutilated body to Pompey just for the sake of Mithridates making a quiet getaway? But that's not really got anything to substantiate it. So in the end, he sort of disappears off into the north, and that's after he does make a final appeal to Pompey whilst on the run to maybe take the Tigranes way out of maybe proposing to go back to being a vassal state of the Romans. But at that stage, Pompey declines that offer and says no, there can only be one Tigranes, and that's when he disappears off north. So
Adrian Mayer suggests that maybe he managed to sneak off in the night and deceive Pompey. It's an interesting idea, but by that time in 63 BC, he'd been king for like more than 50 years, so he wasn't exactly getting any younger, so it's not that strange to suggest that he probably didn't survive the encounter, but but it's we don't really know precisely what happened. It's a mystery.
There's even conspiracy theories
he might
about
still
it,
be alive with Adolf Hitler in Brazil somewhere. Who knows?
And Elvis. Maybe it's a Ra's al Ghul Lazarus pit and he's not actually died. He just keeps regenerating. So, Appian thought the wars changed forever the relationship between Roman Greece. Why?
Because that's his big theme. Appian is all about the development of Roman warfare, and it plays nicely into him that he can sort of style that. But whether it wasn't Mithridates, I mean, if seeing it from his perspective, he's looking to carve out his corner of the globe. But whether it's actually appropriately an east versus west scenario, or whether that's simplifying it too much.
And I think there might also be a bit of punishment, the Roman attitude of, if you rebel, we'll conquer you totally. That because the Greek states sided with, for the most part, with Mithridates, then there's sort of that distrust and suppression follows.
So my final question, my final sort of train of thought was, so Rome now affirms its grip on Anatolia. Do you think it would have eventually got there anyway, or did this just hasten the process, or do you think it would have been not as interested?
I think that given the latent power of Rome, it was be inevitable that they would seek to expand their suzerainty over Anatolia and far into the Near East. When I think about Rome and the various powerful non-Roman states that she encountered in the course of the expansion of her empire. And I'm thinking there's Dacia, which was very powerful. Mithridates was powerful. The Seleucid Empire was very powerful. Egypt too. They all came within the Roman dominion, with the exception of Parthia slash Persia. I've been thinking, just is there any way that Mithridates, if he had been more successful, could have held out and maintained some sort of independent kingdom outside of Roman orbit indefinitely? I don't know. Just I think the Romans were just extremely tough opponents, and at the root, their armies were just so good that they pretty much defeated everybody who they could face in a straight up land battle, with the exception of the Parthians and Persians, who were very formidable on open terrain where their cavalry could be used to best effect. So I think that Mithridates' days would have been numbered. Even if he had been successful, his kingdom would probably have eventually succumbed to the Romans. Eventually,
what makes the Persians / Parthians different, and what Rome continues to fight wars on that frontier for centuries, and attempt conquest and get pushed back and get conquered and then blah 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 blah. And there's that argument that the logistics is just too far from Rome, hence Constantinople / Byzantium. But even the Byzantine Romans don't push that frontier too much further into Parthian and Persian territory. So I think, there's sort of a natural limit, if you like, but not that Rome doesn't keep trying.
Right. I think that's probably enough for now. I'd like to thank Josho, Murray, Marc and Marc. Don't forget to subscribe to the magazine. Go to ancient-warfare.com. You can also find us on Facebook with the rather guessable name of Ancient Warfare Magazine. So until next time, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.